All right, so 7 o'clock, I think people are still going to be streaming in. Welcome everyone. The discussion tonight is called Election Disinformation. My name is Claudia with Women's March Minnesota. Thank you all for joining us. We are having two speakers tonight. Our first speaker is Mary Messel, who is a scientist and a local community activist who has an interest specifically in technology and the impact of data on our political system. And then we also have Terry Burke with us today, who is an educator and a community peace and media activist. So looking forward to hearing what they have to say. Just a couple of housekeeping things that I want to point out is I have decided that we're going to go ahead and turn off the chat for now. I know sometimes it's nice to have the chat, but depending on how many people we have tonight, it can kind of get bogged down with, as it's scrolling through. So what I'm going to have people do is if they have a question or if they have technical issues or anything like that, to go ahead and chat the host. And you should still be able to chat the host with any questions that you have. And also, if you yourself have some resources or things that you want to share with the larger group as a whole, as a takeaway, I'm going to go ahead and plan on gathering those. So you can go ahead and chat those to the host as well. And I can put those together at the end and share that with the group afterwards. But because we only have an hour reserved for this evening, I'm going to go ahead and turn over the screen to our first speaker, Mary Messel. You're on.
Okay, thank you. I will share my slides. And I will.
Are you hearing something?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear? Okay, good. So the point that I want to make to you today is that while propaganda and espionage have always existed and have always been dangerous, the era of big data, I hope you can hear the capital letters in my voice there, has made these techniques of control dramatically more effective. In Silicon Valley, you hear about big data all the time. They say it changes everything. They say it is disruptive. They talk about disruption a lot, like Uber disrupted the taxi industry and Amazon has disrupted retail. And the figures there show how real those disruptions are for the legacy players. Most people don't get their news from newspapers anymore. They get their news from their news feed, mixed in with updates from their friends and family. And just like before, that's advertiser funded. But now, since everyone is reading their own personal news feed customized to them, the advertisements are customized too. That's where big data comes in, because Facebook, for instance, knows so much about you and has the ability to customize your news feed. They can offer an unprecedented service to advertisers. I personally have bought Facebook ads targeted toward conservative women over 60 in northern Minnesota. But Facebook will also let you target ads more narrowly than that. People who like Star Wars, live in the suburbs, and react to stories about animals. Or people who like guns, live in the Mountain West, and react to stories about Jewish people. I am not making that last thing up. Until journalists called them out on it, Facebook let advertisers specifically target anti-Semitic and white supremacist audiences. Now, that is not actually a decision that a Facebook executive made. It was a decision made by an algorithm, a computer program, which notices patterns in what people like and creates advertiser targetable categories of people from those patterns. An algorithm noticed that a lot of people were kind of anti-Semitic and helpfully gave advertisers the ability to target that audience. So that is how Facebook disrupted the news industry. They replaced human editors with algorithms. So now, it's a heck of a lot cheaper to put together a news feed than it once would have been, each person having their own individual customized one. It's like in the past, you would have had to hire your own editor to put together a newspaper just for you every day. And you'd have to have been really rich to afford that before computers. Imagine paying somebody to read dozens of newspapers and postcards and letters from your family and friends and compiling the most interesting and important parts into a little pamphlet for you every day. And that person would have had to have known a lot about you in order to do that. And it just really wouldn't have been possible unless you were maybe the president or a CEO and you had a staff to put together a daily briefing for you. But now we all have a computerized staff doing this for us. So if you are like me, all this stuff about big data and highly targeted ads and disruption and customized news makes you a little uncomfortable, but it seems kind of separate from the other problems that we face as a society, racism and income inequality and climate change and so on. But I want to tell you about another company. This is not literally a Silicon Valley company, but it's the same kind of company in spirit, and how they used Facebook's disruptive advertising tools to disrupt the propaganda industry and make it harder to solve those other problems. The company I want to tell you about is Cambridge Analytica. They wanted to offer something totally new in the field of politics and put all the old experts out of business, like all these Silicon Valley companies. It started as a spin-off from a British military contractor that had specialized in trying to de-radicalize or demoralize terrorists. They called that PSYOPs, psychological operations. And then an American subsidiary was funded by a big tech guy, Robert Mercer, and the man he picked to run Cambridge Analytica, Steve Bannon. A few years later, he became the Trump campaign manager. And the Trump campaign contracted Cambridge Analytica and shared office space with them and had a consultant from Facebook. So here is where we start to see big data and politics touch. Now, I would say political propaganda is just advertising. Instead of trying to get people to buy something, you're trying to get them to take some political action that benefits you. And it's not wrong to say that a lot of political advertising or propaganda is false, is snake oil, is disinformation, but basically it's still just a special category of advertising. And if anyone doesn't think propaganda works, I would ask them, do you think advertising works? If not, an awful lot of companies are wasting billions of dollars. And as I mentioned before, Facebook disrupted the advertising industry in the process of disrupting the news industry. So now I want to pause and say that while I'm telling this story about Facebook and Cambridge Analytica specifically because they were pioneers in this new advertising / propaganda space, there are lots of other companies and entities that are trying to do these same things now. Okay, so what did Cambridge Analytica do? Well, let me quote from a book that was written by one of the guys who helped build the company, who later turned whistleblower, Christopher Wiley. He wrote, "An effective Cambridge Analytica technique was to show subjects blogs that made fun of white people like them, such as people of Walmart. Steve Bannon had been observing online communities on places like 4chan and Reddit for years, and he knew how often subgroups of angry young white men would share content of liberal elites mocking regular Americans. There had always been publications that parodied the hicks of flyover country, but social media represented an extraordinary opportunity to rub regular Americans' noses in the snobbery of coastal elites. Cambridge Analytica began to use this content to touch on an implied belief about racial competition for attention and resources, implying that race relations were a zero-sum game. The more they take, the less you have, and they use political correctness so you cannot speak out." By making people angry in this way, Cambridge Analytica was following a fairly wide corpus of research, showing that anger interferes with information seeking. This is why people can jump to conclusions in a fit of rage, even if later they regret their decisions. In one experiment, Cambridge Analytica would show people from online panels pictures of simple bar graphs about uncontroversial things like the usage rates of mobile phones or sales of a car type, and the majority would be able to read the graph correctly. However, unbeknownst to the respondents, the data behind these graphs had actually been derived from politically controversial topics, such as income inequality, climate change, or deaths from gun violence. When the labels of the same graphs were switched to their actual controversial topic, respondents who were made angry by identity threats were more likely to misread the relabeled graphs that they had previously understood. What Cambridge Analytica observed was that when respondents were angry, their need for complete and rational explanations was also significantly reduced. Bannon was convinced that if you showed people what political correctness really meant, they would wake up to the truth. truth. So Cambridge Analytica started asking subjects if the thought of their daughter marrying a Mexican immigrant made them feel uncomfortable. For subjects who denied discomfort with the idea, a prompt would then follow. Did you feel like you had to say that? Subjects would be given permission to change their answers, and many did. After the Facebook data was collected, Cambridge Analytica began exploring ways of taking this further by pulling photos of daughters of white men in order to pair them with photos of black men, to show white men what political correctness really looked like. So that's the kind of messaging that Cambridge Analytica was interested in. But if you sent that kind of message publicly, if you bought a Super Bowl ad that said, would you want your daughter to marry a Mexican immigrant, or showed a People of Walmart post mocking overweight poor white people, can you imagine the response to that? Can you imagine? Because everybody would see that. It used to be with advertising that you wanted everybody to see your message because that increased the chances that the people who you actually cared about would see it. But now we have targeting. So you can talk to those people and only those people you care about, and nobody else knows what you said. No one can call it out as false or offensive because the people who would see it that way never see it at all. Sometimes you don't even have to buy ads to spread messages like this. Provocative content easily goes viral, but it mostly spreads among certain closely connected communities. As Cambridge Analytica's CEO puts it, we just put information out onto the bloodstream of the internet, and then we watch it grow, he's British, and give it a little push every now and then, like a remote control. It has to happen without anyone thinking that's propaganda, because the moment you think that's propaganda, the next question is who put that out? By the way, Cambridge Analytica's CEO claimed to an undercover reporter that they ran the digital ad campaign, the television campaign, and our data informed all the strategy for the Trump campaign in 2016. Remember, they were Trump campaign contractors. This is what he was saying. We still don't know exactly what type of information they put into the internet's bloodstream in 2016 because the whistleblower who told us about Cambridge Analytica was on the research side, not operations, and he left in 2014. But that's really the point. We don't know. If you can target propaganda, you can prevent it from being recognized and called out as propaganda. But that targeting requires personalized news feeds. And it requires that you have a lot of data about every person in your market so that you know whom to target. And if you know the name Cambridge Analytica at all, you probably know how they were able to do this because that is what they are famous for. They collected Facebook data on 87 million people, at least, without the knowledge of those people. That is about a quarter of the population of the US. Then they combined that Facebook data with census data, credit reports, airline mileage programs, marriage records, and of course, Google Earth has pictures of all of our houses and neighborhoods. Big data. And those people did not realize it was legal for Facebook to give Cambridge Analytica all that data. It's still legal. It wasn't even against Facebook's policies at the time. And it is still legal, by the way, for companies that make apps which use location data on your phone to sell that data. It doesn't have your name attached, but how many other people go from your house to your office every day? And now here's the kicker. The Cambridge Analytica whistleblower, Christopher Wiley, testified in Congress that he believes that Russian intelligence services had access to the data that Cambridge Analytica harvested. We know what Russia was doing now, and it looks a lot like that description that we've heard of Cambridge Analytica's methods: fomenting anger and division and racial tension, targeted digital ads, but also posting a lot of free content in ways designed to go viral among certain audiences only, putting information into the bloodstream of the internet and watching it grow. Christopher Wiley told Congress that one of his Cambridge Analytica colleagues, Alexander Kogan, was working at the same time on Russian-funded projects, including behavioral research. He said, in addition to the Facebook data being accessed in Russia, there are reasonable grounds to suspect that Cambridge Analytica may have been an intelligence target of Russian security services, and that Russian security services may have been notified of the existence of Cambridge Analytica's Facebook data. Wiley himself helped brief executives from Lukoil, a Russian oil company that depends on Kremlin support, on what Cambridge Analytica was doing in American politics. He did not understand why a Russian oil company executive should be interested in that. He said that Cambridge Analytica openly shared information on what they called rumor campaigns and attitudinal inoculation with this company, Lukoil, whose executives have been linked to the Russian intelligence agency FSB. Meanwhile, a longtime associate of Paul Manafort's named Sam Patten was working for Cambridge Analytica's parent company. He later pled guilty after being indicted by the Mueller investigation to working as a foreign agent on behalf of a pro-Russian political party in Ukraine. As early as 2014, when Sam Patten and Alexander Kogan were working with Cambridge Analytica and also for Russian interests, Cambridge Analytica was doing polls in America testing the popularity of Vladimir Putin among Americans. So maybe nobody at Cambridge Analytica was intentionally sharing data with Russia. They all deny that they were, but Russia seems to have been interested in their work and almost certainly had the means to get at that data if they wanted it. And either way, it seems that they were working on a similar project. And here is what we know about what Russia did, besides, is this slide? Besides hacking the DNC servers and everything that came from that. They bought carefully targeted ads on Facebook, Google, Twitter, Instagram, and even Pokemon Go. They made fake accounts on Reddit and Tumblr. They ran Facebook groups and pages purporting to be based in the US, which organized over 100 different protests, including armed protests. They sold merchandise, they paid for activists' travel, and attempted to incite violence. They campaigned for African American voters to boycott elections or follow wrong voting procedures and attempted to inflame racial tensions. They paid trainers in the US to teach self-defense courses and then collected information on the students who attended and encouraged the trainers to provide more aggressive lessons, including training in offensive combat. They offered free counseling to people with sexual addiction. Anybody who accepted that offer would be giving Russian operatives material for blackmail. They left comments on news stories. They operated a Twitter account called @10GOP. There's a picture of that one here in the upper right, which billed itself as the unofficial Twitter account of Tennessee Republicans, and one called @TodayNYCity, which claimed to be New York City's local news on Twitter. Other accounts pretended to be local news sources for other American cities. And Russian accounts retweeted Donald Trump's tweets 470,000 times. A former employee has said of the Internet Research Agency, the Russian Internet Research Agency, our goal wasn't to turn Americans toward Russia. Our goal was to set Americans against their own government, to provoke unrest and discontent, and to lower Obama's support ratings. So you see that mix of online and offline activities, run ads, and also use Facebook to organize in-person events, collect information on people, including information that could be used for blackmail purposes. That characterizes what is now called active measures. It's not only about propaganda, about advertising, it is also about espionage for purposes of control. And Cambridge Analytica seems to have been engaging in a little of that sort of thing too. At least their CEO suggested that they could, quote, send some girls around to the candidate's house, adding that Ukrainian girls are very beautiful. I find that works very well. Or, he said, we'll offer a large amount of money to the candidate to finance his campaign in exchange for land, for instance, and we'll have the whole thing recorded. We'll blank out the face of our guy and we'll post it on the internet. This is all caught on tape by an undercover reporter. You can watch it yourself. So again, the match between what Cambridge Analytica was doing and what the Russian Internet Research Agency was doing seems to be pretty good. I think historian Timothy Snyder summed it up best in his book, The Road to Unfreedom. Donald Trump was the payload of a cyber weapon meant to create chaos and weakness, as in fact he has done. I am almost done. I just want to bring this around to the point that I made earlier. Anybody can do this stuff. There are other companies like Cambridge Analytica, Cygroup, Emerdata, and we know that the Kremlin has been an innovator in this area. A 2011 manual for Russian civil servants favorably compared their methods of disinformation to an invisible radiation that takes effect while the population doesn't feel it is being acted upon. But with technological advances of the past decade and the global proliferation of smartphones, Other governments in Saudi Arabia and UAE and the Philippines and around the world have found success deploying Kremlin-honed techniques against their own people. The world is going through a dramatic political upheaval, and it seems like it can't be a coincidence that it comes at the same moment in history as the widespread adoption of social media, the availability of big data, and the Silicon Valley doctrine of disruption. It seems to me that when you automate the job of newspaper editor and make it cheap enough so that everyone can have their own news, you are also removing the gatekeepers who used to keep out disinformation. And we haven't adjusted to that yet. And there may be no way to adjust without putting new gatekeepers back in, or else becoming so paranoid that we find it hard to trust anyone or anything that we hear, which would make it really hard to work together to solve our problems. Terry is going to talk about what you can do to make sure you don't fall for disinformation. I would just say, don't trust news you didn't pay for. If you're not the customer, you're the product. So buy a newspaper subscription. And then if something seems really outrageous to you, read carefully so that you can understand the reporter's sources and the limits on what they know. But beyond what we can do as individuals, in terms of systematic solutions, I think we need to limit the sharing of personal data. I think we need to have human gatekeepers again, not just algorithms. And there's a law that says Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and so on can't be sued for libel for the stuff their users post. They are not held responsible for any lies that are spread because they are supposedly platforms like the telephone system and not publishers. But it's not true. They make billions of editorial decisions every day. It's just that those decisions are being made by an algorithm. But the fact that you automated your editing doesn't mean you're not a publisher. Facebook would have no users left if they let your feed fill up with spam and stuff that you hate. So they need to be held responsible for publishing lies in the same way that newspapers are, because they control what you see and what you don't see. So that is my policy prescription. Data privacy laws and into social media companies' immunity from libel laws. Treat them like any other publisher. That would screw up their disruptive business model. It would require them to pay for a lot more human editors. But personally, I am okay with that. And that is my talk.
Thanks, Mary. Hi, thanks everyone for joining us tonight, and thanks, Mary, for your amazing research. Disinformation is an enormous topic. I want to focus on disinformation targeting progressives. It's subtly pro-Trump. There is really almost no awareness among progressive activists that we've been targeted. It had a huge effect. Because of it, the left is divided. Many people have been uncertain about Russian interference and how dangerous the Trump presidency is. As one researcher said, the purpose of disinformation is not to convince. The purpose of disinformation is to confuse. It's to create muddled thinking across society. Before we start the slides, I want to introduce my tech guy, magically appearing, Andrew Berman, my husband. And thank you, Andy, for your help with this. One result, slide, of the disinformation is that we have not had the massive protests that we should have had throughout Trump's presidency. There were not huge protests during impeachment. Here are some of the headlines asking, where are the protests? We've needed protests against Trump that were as large as the Black Lives Matter protests. Instead, tens of thousands of hours have been spent arguing about Syria and Russian interference, time that could have been spent organizing. And I'll be going through the slides pretty quickly, but they'll be posted on Facebook afterwards. People will not get out there and organize protests if they're not sure of what's happening. The disinformation has been very destructive to having an effective, united left. The peace movement opposes bombing, nuclear, chemical warfare, drones, but we don't even acknowledge that foreign disinformation is another form of warfare. There's an assumption that Russian propaganda is not very sophisticated. The opposite is true. It's so sophisticated that most of us don't even recognize it. Slide. RT Russia Today is a Russian government-funded outlet. Its founding editor has compared it with the Russian Army and Defense Ministry and talked about RT, quote, waging information war against the Western world, unquote. Russia recently passed a law forbidding disrespecting the Russian government online, punishable with a 15-day jail sentence. End. There is no place for independent journalism in Putin's Russia. Don't mistake RT for progressive journalism. It's a sophisticated example of information warfare, according to its own editor. Syria activists were among the first to spot some of the sophisticated foreign disinformation back in 2012. And we know how powerful it is. We've fought it for 8 years. On one hand, we've worked with hundreds of Syrians, activists, nonviolence advocates, writers, academics, young people, who all described a genuine revolution against the brutal Assad dictatorship. On the other hand, Western left writers have been telling us that it is a US regime change operation to overthrow Assad. Yes, many proxy forces entered the war, but at heart, it's been Assad bombing and killing the Syrian people. However, because of the disinformation, much of the left is unsure or believes the line that it's a US regime change operation. This has created a very divisive split in the peace movement. Next. Historians tell us to go to the original source, and that would be Syrians. This slide shows some of the many books by Syrians about the war. They describe a courageous revolution against Assad. Next. This slide shows some of the documentary films by Syrians. Same. They show Syrians' lives in the revolutionary struggle. I know of no books or films by Syrians that support the US regime change line. Unfortunately, the left internet has been dominated by articles by Western writers and articles that echo Assad and Russia's talking points about US regime change. Who's the reliable source on Syria? Syrians themselves or Western writers? New slide. A study from a research lab at the University of Washington showed that in the summer of 2017, there were 4 times as many disinformation tweets compared to tweets from factual articles, tweets about the Syrian White Helmets, a volunteer rescue group. The blue cluster are the disinformation tweets. The purple cluster in the left corner is the mainstream media. The White Helmets cameras provide evidence that Assad and Russia are bombing civilians, committing war crimes. Hence the disinformation campaign to discredit them. End. So 4 times as many tweets linked to disinformation. No wonder we've had a difficult time countering it. The disinformation simply overwhelmed the truth. Slide. The UW study also identified so-called independent alternative media, this is the first column, involved in spreading the anti-White Helmets disinformation. The study called it an ecosystem with Russian, Syrian, and Iranian government-funded media. They are promoting the talking points of those governments. The second column is related media that share some of the same themes. Early in 2016, we started noticing that some of these same so-called progressive media that were pro-Assad, next, also had the same line on the US election, trashing Clinton as the worst warmongering, next, evil, next, corrupt president ever, next, equating Clinton and Trump. They're both just clowns. Next, going easy on Trump and discouraging voting. Again, these will be on Facebook later. These memes were shared tens of thousands of times. You probably saw some of them. These were not the election ads paid for in Russian rubles. They were posts by supposedly progressive sites, the pro-Assad sites. I know these vicious anti-Clinton memes influence Facebook friends. Next. This is the one disparaging voting. These memes dominated Facebook. We observed these pro-Assad sites, the Free Thought Project, the Anti-Media and others, helped depress the progressive vote for Clinton. Next. Allison Gill's story illustrates the problem. She was a strong Bernie supporter in 2016 and was so bombarded with negative messages about Clinton that she almost didn't vote. She later realized that those messages came from, quote, bots, trolls, and manipulated US persons, unquote. And she sees it happening again in 2020. She's a writer and an excellent person to follow on Twitter. And Democrats who stayed home in 2016 cost Clinton the election. She got roughly 10 million fewer votes than Obama in 2012. All the disinformation articles and memes directed at left and Black voters certainly played a role. Mary mentioned Timothy Snyder. He's a Yale historian whose focus is authoritarian regimes. In describing how Russia defeated America in 2016, he makes one point that really should be obvious. Russia created the persona of Trump, the successful businessman. As Snyder says, Trump was a spectacularly failed businessman. Next. When US banks refused to lend to him in the 1990s, he was rescued by licensing deals and Russian infusions of cash, which allowed him to present himself as a successful businessman. Don Jr. said in 2008, "We see a lot of money pouring in from Russia." And without Russian money, we wouldn't have had Trump on The Apprentice TV show, or Trump as a candidate for president, or Trump as president. Next slide. Shortly after the election, the 2016 election, articles about Russian propaganda in our election started to appear. Next. Immediately, left writers lined up to denounce the idea of Russian influence. Glenn Greenwald, Stephen Cohen, Matt Taibbi, Norman Solomon, Robert Perry, Max Blumenthal, and others scoffed at the idea of Russian interference. They said it was just the Democrats' excuse for losing to Trump, the new McCarthyism, Russia hysteria, overblown. There is great reluctance by the left to make Russia the enemy and return to the hostilities of the Cold War era. The Russiagate skepticism builds on that. Next. But in fact, in the last 3.5 years, there's been extensive evidence of Russian interference. From the Mueller report. Next. Reports from the EU. Recent info that Mueller was blocked from even probing Trump's Russia ties. Next. And the bombshell Senate report in August, where even the Republicans say there was an aggressive, multifaceted attempt by the Russians to influence the elections. And despite all this information, there are still, in 2020, writers who denounce the claims of Russian interference. Let's be clear, they are supporting Trump and Putin's position by doing so. Why are these so-called progressive media, The Intercept, The Nation, Gray Zone, Chris Hedges, continually defending Trump and Putin and Russia? Money, ideology, the influence of other left writers? How could the CIA and FBI be right and Chris Hedges and Glenn Greenwald be wrong? But Chris Hedges is paid by the Russian government. He's had a regular show on RT for a couple of years. We don't know the motivation of other Russiagate skeptics. Result, some of my progressive acquaintances have been unsure about Russian interference. Next. A Senate report in 2018 looked at millions of Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook posts for 3 years, from 2014 through 2017. These originated from Russia's Internet Research Agency. The disinformation began well before 2014, and it continues today. We know the CIA has done this for years in other countries, but that doesn't make it okay for other countries to interfere here. All interference in other nations is wrong. End. Of course, there is still disinformation now around the 2020 elections. But election disinformation is not just the disinformation for a few months before the elections. It's the continuation of years of those themes, equating Democrats and Republicans, encouraging cynicism about voting, years of downplaying Trump's crimes. The left sites that push Russiagate skepticism are still relatively easy on Trump, not outraged by his authoritarianism. They aren't giving much coverage to Trump's disastrous handling of COVID, not much coverage to Barr's authoritarian moves, or to Trump's secret police, or to his actions accelerating climate change. So it's not just the false information, it's also what is not covered that can influence us. There is a long history on the left of equating the two parties as being part of the same corrupt system. The disinformation amplifies that line of thinking. Some of these media focus more on problems with the Democrats or problems with the system. So there are still people who don't see much difference between Trump and Biden. It's been a huge disservice to the left by these media to downplay how dangerous and criminal the Trump regime has been. Some of these same sites have been spreading the anti-Fauci, anti-science COVID conspiracy theories, adding to the confusion. We're on the verge of losing all democracy, of Trump stealing the elections, and parts of the left have not been clear about what has been happening. The disinformation has contributed to muddled thinking. Some people still haven't fully comprehended how critical it is that he be defeated, how important it is to the survival of the planet, to the retention of any democracy here. I think some of the recent revelations about Trump and Russia, about Attorney General Barr, and now Ruth Bader Ginsburg's death have helped make people aware of the authoritarian danger we're facing. This year, I don't see the memes everywhere on Facebook denouncing Biden and Harris like there were in 2016 against Clinton. Some of those sites were taken down by Facebook, and although they've republished, they have a fraction of their millions of followers. New slide. Here are just a couple sample anti-Biden posts from so-called progressive sites, equating Biden the rapist with Trump the rapist. Next. Other direction. Lee Camp, has a show on Russia Today. Next. So Biden is the warmonger versus Trump. This is the Jimmy Dore show, which is part of this alternative media. And it's really impossible to calculate the damage that years of this disinformation and propaganda has had on us. The Russian disinformation exploits and amplifies existing divisions in our society. Divisions within the left, within the Black community, divisions between the left and the right. Also, many of the sites that push Russiagate skepticism don't encourage us to organize, don't tell us how we can fight back. With the post office problem, legitimate left sites promoted the protests, told people what they could do locally. The sites that are more pro-Assad, pro-Russia, encourage a cynicism, a hopelessness in how corrupt the system is, how the US is unraveling without any call for action. What can we do? How do we decide what's true, what's disinformation? I certainly don't have all the answers. Next slide. There are some basics about determining what is factual. Think for yourself, check your source, consult the fact checkers, Snopes, PolitiFact, Fact Check, wait for the whole story, be informed. Next. The Washington Post, New York Times, NPR, BBC are generally reliable sources. Yes, we know they're biased towards corporations and the US government. Mainstream media has many faults, but they do care about facts. One of the major propaganda themes from the Russian IRA is to distrust the mainstream media. That's a very common meme. Don't trust the mainstream media, but then you're supposed to trust these obscure sites that we have no idea who's behind them, who's funding them. And let's look at specific progressive sites. One easy thing to do to clear some disinformation from your sources is to eliminate media connected to the Russian government. Russia was the main source of disinformation in 2016. Their mission is information warfare against the Western world. Of course, there's this disinformation not connected to Russia, but Russia is a major source. RT and Sputnik are the two English language Russian TV stations. They're propaganda stations, not reliable. Two of the more well-known shows on RT are Chris Hedges on Contact and Lee Camp's Redacted Tonight, not reliable. New slide. Last year, CNN exposed that In the Now, Wasted, and Soapbox were Russian-owned. Facebook and YouTube now identify them as Russian state-controlled media, but they're contesting that label because they were supposedly bought by another party. Not reliable. And there are different levels of connection to the Russian government. They all share Russian themes: pro-Assad, pro-Putin, criticizing Democrats, Biden and Harris, easy on Trump, downplaying Trump's criminal acts, dismissing Russian interference. New slide. One level is the ecosystem identified, that's the first column, by the University of Washington Research. The second column is other media sites loosely connected to them that share Russian talking points. The third column is a partial list of the writers who are Russiagate skeptics, who also often share the Russian themes. These are not reliable media, and this isn't a complete list by any means. And another group is formerly trustworthy progressive sites that I used to use that now consistently promote Russian themes: antiwar.com, Counterpunch, Consortium News, Information Clearinghouse, Op-Ed News. They're not reliable at this point. They certainly were in the past. Evaluating The Intercept and The Nation is more complicated. They have many excellent articles, but they also give prominent coverage to Russiagate skeptics, Glenn Greenwald and Stephen Cohen. Slide. These sites don't criticize Russia and often are easy on Trump. In this article, Greenwald criticizes the recent Atlantic article and journalists who used anonymous sources to confirm that Trump called soldiers who died in war suckers and losers. Journalists have used anonymous sources forever. Greenwald's article is just another example of his not so subtle support for Trump. Next. Sources to trust. While Twitter is often used to spread rumors and falsehoods, it's really also a great way to get quick analysis from some of the best minds in the country. Researchers and scholars can frequently identify the disinformation, the media manipulation, and provide invaluable commentary as news unfolds. Now, most of these people are on Twitter. Heather Cox Richardson is a historian who has daily analysis. They're posted on Facebook. And Nancy McLean is a historian with a very important book, Democracy in Chains. She's going to be president at a couple virtual forums here within the next 2 weeks. And just be careful who you follow on Twitter. Only follow people you know who are reliable sources. We've covered only a small part of the disinformation problem. Disinformation that downplays Russian interference, that criticizes Democrats more than Trump. It's meant to confuse us. It makes us feel cynical and hopeless. All of this muddles our thinking and discourages people from taking action. I hope our forum tonight helps you recognize and avoid disinformation and defeatism. Share this information with your friends. Let's take our lead from the indomitable Ruth Bader Ginsburg and do everything we can to win this November and to continue the struggle to make the US and the planet more democratic, equitable, and sustainable. Thank you. Thanks. Claudia, back to you.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Terry, and thank you, Mary. Such an informative presentation. I really enjoyed listening to that. Just a couple questions here. I am wondering here, is there any sense of how we can find out if there are active Russian campaigns happening right now during this election cycle? Has there been any word on that or discussions?
Oh, certainly. There definitely is. Yeah, definitely. One thing to do is follow the disinformation researchers I just mentioned on Twitter and the authoritarian scholars. they are talking about the disinformation campaigns that are going on now. Yes, they're continuation of the themes from 2016. They're trying to smear Biden, smear Kamala Harris, make people cynical about voting. They're amplifying Trump's theme that voting by mail is not going to be legitimate. Do you have more to add to that, Mary?
Um, yeah, I was going to see if I could pull up a couple of articles. I don't know if I can do it fast enough, but Microsoft recently released a report on hacking attempts that they have observed. And in particular, Russia is trying to hack the Biden campaign the way they hacked the DNC in 2016. And there are a bunch of different candidates that Microsoft noticed apparently Russian hacking attempts of. They're not the only country. China and Iran have also been trying to do things. There's a line, by the way, the Republicans claim that China wants Joe Biden to win, and this is, there seems to maybe be some small preference that China would have for Biden. Nevertheless, Microsoft said China had attempted to hack the Biden campaign. Facebook and Twitter have also been putting out reports. These companies are becoming more transparent. So they've been deleting a bunch of propaganda accounts again this year, and still, and so, you know, I can try to dig up those links for people afterwards if they want. But there's all of these big internet companies have been noticing the same behaviors, both hacking and propaganda. And then, of course, the intelligence agencies have put out statements as well, saying, yes, this is still going on. And as Terry mentioned, even the Senate the Republican-led Senate Intelligence Committee released this comprehensive report, which is just surprisingly candid about all of this, considering what the politicians on that committee are willing to say publicly. The staff who put together the report are willing to be really frank, it appears, and they talk about some of the ongoing efforts as well. So it's like from every source that's in a position to know, it's yes, absolutely, this is still ongoing.
Okay. Okay, thank you. And that's just horrible. But have there been any attempts to restrict social media from being able to behave as they do as a news source versus what they are currently supposed to be? Any proposed bills that have ever been attempted to be pushed through?
Amy Klobuchar had a good one that was it was almost very minimalist, but of course it still didn't go anywhere in the Senate. She just basically said, the laws that we already have for TV ads, you know, I am so-and-so and I approve this message, that needed to be applied on Facebook and Twitter and wherever as well. And that Facebook needed to disclose who had paid for an ad. You know, or whatever social media company needed to disclose who had paid for an ad. And in particular, that would have revealed the American political ads that were paid for in rubles in 2016. So that's, you know, that's not as far as like I advocate for this relatively, that would be very upsetting to the social media companies to get rid of the section of the, I think it's part of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, the DMCA from like 1995, that says that these companies are platforms and can't be sued. That would be my suggested measure, and I think people have tried to do that, but that would probably really just destroy these companies. So like, I'm like, okay, that's fine, we can destroy these companies, but there are a lot of people who would be upset if that happened. That hasn't really gone anywhere at all, but neither has the very minimalist measure of like, okay, let's just apply the same rules we already have for TV to social media. That's also not moving at all in the Senate.
All right. Thank you, Mary. Yeah, I think something definitely needs to be done. I don't know if I have the answer today, but I'm hoping people are thinking about that, people who are in positions of power. Well, those are all of the written questions that I have down here. You know, I know we do have some people who are joining us by phone too. And I think we are a small enough size group that, you know, we can maybe go ahead and open it up. I don't know if my admin behind the scenes can allow people to unmute and go ahead and pipe in if they have any other questions for Mary or Terry here tonight.
We've got some questions in the chat. Let's see. Is there any difference between misinformation and disinformation so far?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah. Can we answer that one and go from there?
It goes on. Yeah, if you want to do that. Before, it says, before social media, we have seen propagandist information via TV ads, newspapers, etc.
I'm asking you a question.
So in social media era, how can we overtake disinformation with information?
Well, the first part was easier.
Yeah.
Is accidental. Kate Starbird identifies misinformation as something that accidentally was misportrayed, whereas disinformation is intentional. It's intentional disinformation. And the second part of the question was how to what? How to... You're muted, Shannon. Or Mary, answer if you understand. I can't remember the second part.
Oh, it was how do we stop it? And of course, that's the $64,000 question, right? And I think as individuals, we can protect ourselves by the methods that I mentioned earlier. Like, just try to think like you're a journalist. Like, where did this information come from? Was it confirmed? And who's the source and what are their motives? And good journalists will put all of that into a story, and you can read the story and actually ask some of these questions about, like, okay, wait, how does the journalist know this? What did they say about where they got this information? And what do they say about the limits of the information that they have? Because again, a good journalist will put that into a story. You can look up, I don't know how to summarize it all quickly, but there's a lot of good journalistic practices that have developed in the industry over many years. And basically, journalists who don't follow those guidelines are not trustworthy. And so if you learn a little bit more about, how journalists are supposed to write, and then you see something that's not written that way, you shouldn't trust it. And then separately, the policy prescriptions I already mentioned. I don't know what that noise is. I don't think
it sounds like somebody wants to speak, but maybe they're a little.
I would say there really does have to be legislation. These Facebook and Google have made billions of dollars by employing very few people to monitor what's true and what's not. I don't know how many of you saw a BuzzFeed article from last week where an employee quit who was burned out and felt that she had blood on her hands because she was responsible for determining the truth of information in several countries around the world. And massacres have occurred with the Rohingya. Facebook helped foster the hatred and the violence. There really is a responsibility that these platforms cannot allow these hate messages, this disinformation to be propagated while they make billions of dollars. There has to be some kind of monitoring, and they're not going to make as much money, but so be it. They have to be more responsible. And I don't think Mary listed, there are a lot of good ways that we can make ourselves immune to the disinformation and the propaganda. But there are so many people who don't have time to do that and who are vulnerable to it. And if it matches something that confirms a bias you already have, you're likely to believe it. And we can't expect, you know, our population of a couple 100 million people to become tech literate. The platforms have to be more responsible in getting rid of disinformation.
Thank you. I agree. With
It-
both of you.
Can I just put in one more thought?
Sure thing, Mary.
This is just I want to paraphrase something that Josh Marshall from Talking Points Memo said. He said that nuclear is a metaphor, nuclear power. He said, nuclear power is the cheapest thing in the world to make. You dig up some rocks out of the ground and you squish them together and they heat up and turn a turbine and make energy. It is dirt cheap to make electricity with nuclear power. The problem is then you have nuclear waste. And what is not cheap is getting rid of nuclear waste. And so the metaphor is Facebook is like the nuclear power company that just throws the waste on the side of the road. Like just, you know, just dump it on the side of the road and makes billions of dollars that way because the racism and the propaganda, that's the waste. It's expensive to remove and it's dangerous and it's hard to remove. And it ruins their business model if they try to remove it, because their business model is to be hugely profitable by making social media, which is dirt cheap to make, and then the externalities of that, the waste, the toxic stuff that comes out of that, they've decided that's not their problem, that's our problem. So they're basically a nuclear power company that doesn't bother to dispose of its waste, and the waste is the racism, and it's just all landing on all of us. It's gross.
Yes, definitely gross. All right, so I'm going to have to bring us to our close tonight. I want to thank everybody for joining us in this space. Before I go, though, I do want to put in a plug for some activist opportunities. Because if you don't know this already, we have 39 days left to Election Day. I can't believe it's almost here. And this is probably one of the most important elections in our lifetimes. So if you haven't already voted, I would encourage you to consider early voting or to get an absentee ballot. I know some people are hesitant to use the mail right now, and so if that makes you hesitant, there are election offices in your community where you can drop off those absentee ballots. But voting isn't the only way that we can make change right now. Right now, there are many opportunities for phone banking and text banking, literature drops. If you've never considered the option of being an election judge, that's also something that a lot of communities are looking for right now. Typically during election season, older Americans are the folks that are stepping up to work in the polls. But because of the pandemic, there have been a decrease in people who have been stepping up and taking those roles. And as a result, there are communities that are reporting a shortage of election judges right now. And if a polling station does not have enough election judges, then that polling station will have to close. And the last thing that we want right now are for any polling stations to be closed. And so what I'm going to do is I have gathered a little bit of a list of communities that I know of that are in Minnesota that are still looking for election judges. And I'm going to post that in the chat here in a second. And so if you could consider working as an election judge during election day, or taking a look at the list, and if you see somebody that you know that lives in one of these communities that might be able to help out, to kind of encourage them to help out in that way. And then I'd also like to encourage everyone here to check out our website, Minnesota Women's March, Minnesota. We do have an Election Central page that's dedicated to elections, which we are trying to keep updated as best that we can. And we also have a legislative action team. So if you are interested in getting active in the legislation of things in our state, then will be active in that post-election, working to move progressive causes within our state. And I know Terry wanted to share something really quick on a Facebook group. So I'm going to turn the screen over to her again for just a second.
Thanks, Claudia, and thanks for organizing this. Appreciate it. Disinformation is a huge topic. There's news every day. My tech guy just gave me, oh, this is gonna be backwards for you though. Yesterday's New York Times did have an article on how Russian trolls' star content provider is Trump. So the trolls are promoting Trump's messages, the Russian trolls. But we did start a Facebook group discussion, disinformation discussion. If you'd like to continue the discussion and learn more, there's more information every day, and some of it is complicated. It's disinformation discussion. You can ask to join it. There are a couple questions that we'll ask, and it is a private group for internal discussions. Thank you. Thanks everybody for coming.
All right, I just posted that link in our chat. So if you want to grab that and copy it onto a document or take a picture of it or something like that, you can take a look at it and spread the word. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming tonight. We'll see you.
Thank you.